form. In the 20th century, as we know, socialism came to be not the norm, but one of the major forces that was fighting for control over the societies of the Western world. And the socialist view of politics is very different from the view that we conservatives have, certainly very different from the view that Janet rightly attributed to Edmund Burke. The conservative view is that politics exists in order to maintain peace and the rule of law and permit civil society to develop and to grow and to flourish according to its own natural logic. Civil society is the end, politics is just the means to ensure that it doesn't grow out of control, to keep boundaries, in other words. For the socialist, the purpose, politics has a purpose and a goal of its own. It's not there to permit the development of individual goals through the civil association and the little platoons and so on. It's there to remake society according to a new model. The new model is one in which the equality of all will be the ruling principle, and the liberation of previously oppressed minorities will be one of the means to achieve this. The state has, in other words, a vision of the end point to which it is directing everything, and law has to answer to that vision. So it has the right to override the individual sovereignty in the process of producing this new society. That vision, interestingly enough, is already there in the 1945 Universal Declaration of Human Rights that was brought into being by Eleanor Roosevelt, and is the founding document of the United Nations. It begins with a statement of rights, which is very close to the English-speaking tradition. That rights, our basic human rights include the freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, freedom of association, the right to pursue happiness in our own way, and so on. In other words, it reaffirms the sovereignty of the individual. But by, I think it's number 26 already, that it's got that far suggests that something's gone wrong. But by number 26, it's talking of a right to health, a right to a rewarding life, a right to develop in the way that human beings naturally develop, and so on. All kinds of rights are being specified, which can't necessarily be achieved by an individual working alone. They are rights which require the state to enter on the individual's behalf and divert resources in his direction. And we've seen these new rights, which are essentially claims against the public purse, we've seen them grow in recent years under the influence of things like the Human Rights Commission here, and the working of the courts, in particular the European Courts of Human Rights in Europe. And there have been two particular ways in which this development has advanced rapidly in recent years. One is through the idea of non-discrimination. The right to non-discrimination is something which is not there, of course, in the traditional Bill of Rights or in the American Declaration of Independence or Constitution, but it is something which is recognized by the European Court of Human Rights and has therefore been written into our legislation under the Human Rights Act in Britain. It means that in any privilege that's granted or any contract of employment, it becomes actually a criminal offence to discriminate on grounds of, and then it's an open-ended list of race, sex, ethnic identity, religion, sexual orientation, ... And the courts, of course, constantly find new ways of affirming that somebody has been discriminated against. So far, nobody has been able to prove that non-discrimination clauses protect conservatives. But we are, in fact, the only group that is regularly discriminated against. Everybody else has the privileges of this law. And I think the result, of course, is a massive intrusion into the sovereignty of the individual on behalf of the creation of a new kind of socialist order. But there's another way in which the idea of human rights is being expanded beyond the beyond the realm of individual sovereignty, and that's through what I would call the offence machine. You know, we all know that freedom of speech means that people say things which are quite offensive. And we've had examples of this. Obviously, people make racist remarks and sexist remarks and so on. This could be part of the ordinary banter of friendly conversation, but there's always a line over which it shouldn't step. Then, of course, when people overstep that line, have they committed a crime or not? Modern courts and modern commentators are increasingly worried about this because, of course, in an egalitarian society, you don't actually know whether you have been insulted or not. Just to point out that you're an ordinary example of the human species is, to me, an insult, but I keep quiet about it. But anything that can be said can be taken as an insult. Who is to determine who is insulting whom? And when should that be a crime, if at all? Obviously, the common law has dealt with this over centuries. Sedition has always been a crime, a common law crime. And so is incitement to violence. And John Stuart Mill, in his famous book on liberty, makes a clear exception for those sort of things. Saying something which is actually intended to incite people to murder or whatever has always been a crime in English law. But things that you say can have bad consequences, even if you don't intend them. I can say, I wonder whether Muhammad was really inspired or really given words directly from the Almighty, and that might produce a riot, regardless of my intention simply to open an interesting topic of discussion. But it's not my fault, and yet, of course, as we know, there's an extraordinary ability of people to take offence when it suits them. And to indicate that this offence has occurred, even before they've fully felt it. Being offended is a dramatic capacity of human beings. It's a histrionic ability. That's to say that if you begin by pretending you're offended, then you see you've got the response, then you feel you are really offended, and eventually you've worked yourself up into a state of anger which you cannot yourself control. That's your problem, of course. But in the modern world, the well-meaning liberals wish to make it the problem of the person who first started this process going. So we have a lot of people coming to courts, especially in America, saying that they felt offended or insulted as a woman, as a gay, as a Muslim, and so on, by this or that pronouncement, and that the person concerned should be either forced to pay a fine or in some way criminalized. And that, I think, is one of the issues which is becoming more and more serious, because although it may not lead to legislative pronouncements like your Section 18C, it is still there, active in the imagination of the courts and active in the imagination of the journalists who report on things, and also active in the imagination and the fears of ordinary people. People begin to censor themselves. Self-censorship is now a very important feature of our public discourse in the West, not only in newspapers, but also, of course, in universities and so on. And This is amplified, again, from the left by the invention of a most extraordinary concept, the concept of the phobia.